Have you ever been like in the middle of a game and you just kind of think to yourself like, huh, what if I could be the bad guy?
Oh, yeah.
What if I could like really explore, what makes the quote-unquote villain tick?
I get that. It's like, it's so interesting to explore the other side of the coin.
Yeah.
Especially when it comes to fantasy worlds.
Yeah.
Where like the lines between good and evil can get kind of blurry.
Totally.
And speaking of blurry lines, you are not going to believe what Dungeons & Dragons is doing in their 2024 edition.
Okay, I'm ready.
So remember like orcs?
Oh, yeah.
Like they're always the go-to baddies, right?
The mindless horde?
The mindless horde. Yeah, you just hack and slash through them.
Right.
Well, they completely removed orcs from the monster manual.
What? Really?
Yeah.
So like no more epic orc battles? What are players supposed to fight now?
It's not about getting rid of orcs. It's about evolving them.
Okay.
Like in this edition, they're not just mindless monsters anymore. They're actually a fully playable race, just like elves or dwarves.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's a huge change.
Yeah, right. And it really like makes you think beyond just good versus evil,
Right. It's like a much more nuanced look.
Exactly.
Yeah. So like, why now? Like what made D&D make this kind of big shift?
Well, I think it's part of like this growing awareness we're having about like harmful stereotypes, especially in traditional fantasy.
Yeah.
Orcs often they embody these like problematic tropes about, savage, unintelligent others.
Right.
Which, let's face it, aren't really the most nuanced or like sensitive representations.
Yeah. So by making them playable,
Yeah.
it's like forcing us to engage with them on a deeper level.
Exactly. Instead of just being enemies to defeat, they can be potential allies, rivals, or even just people trying to live their lives.
Right. They're just trying to exist.
Exactly.
And now we have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So like what kind of stories can this tell? Like what does this change?
Oh, man. The storytelling possibilities are huge.
Yeah.
Like imagine a campaign where you have to negotiate a peace treaty
Okay.
between an orc tribe and a human kingdom. Oh, that's interesting.
Or like uncover a conspiracy that threatens to like reignite a war between different orc clans.
Oh, that would be so cool.
Yeah, it adds like this whole other layer of
Yeah.
depth and intrigue.
Right, because it's not just like good guys versus bad guys anymore. It's like
Exactly.
orcs versus orcs and humans versus humans.
It's like a web.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it can get really intense.
So it's not just another dungeon crawl. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're suddenly dealing with politics,
Yeah.
culture, and like morals and all this stuff.
Totally. It's way more complex.
Yeah. But this change also presents challenges, right?
It does.
Especially for dungeon masters.
Yeah.
Because if there are no orc stat blocks in the monster manual,
Right.
how do you actually run an orc character or like an encounter with orcs?
Exactly.
Yeah, so how does that work?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay, I'm listening.
So instead of like giving dungeon masters a set of rules,
Yeah.
they're encouraging them to get creative.
Okay.
Yeah. So they can take existing stat blocks from other races
Uh-huh.
and tweak them to fit their vision of an orc.
Oh,
Or they can even design their own stats from scratch.
wow.
Yeah. So it gives a lot of power to the dungeon master.
That sounds like a lot of work, though.
It can be,
Yeah.
especially for like, designing a whole culture and a stat system from scratch.
Yeah. Like even for experienced dungeon masters, that could be.
Daunting.
Yeah.
But I think that's also what makes it exciting.
Okay.
It makes you really think about like what makes orcs unique?
Right.
What are their cultural strengths
Yeah.
and weaknesses?
Uh-huh.
How do they interact with the world differently than other races?
Yeah, it's like you have to come up with a whole new way of thinking about them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a chance for dungeon masters to like really get creative and build something totally unique.
So it's not just about changing the mechanics of the game.
Right.
It's about changing the way we think about orcs and fantasy races in general.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about getting rid of those old stereotypes.
And embracing a more nuanced and realistic view.
So this isn't just happening like in a vacuum. Like,
Right.
What has the community reaction been?
Well, the D&D community has been like buzzing about this.
Yeah.
There's been some pretty strong reactions,
Yeah.
both positive and negative.
Okay. Tell me more about that. Yeah.
All right, so some players are like super excited about it.
Uh-huh.
They see it as a really positive step towards a more inclusive and thoughtful D&D.
Okay.
They love the idea of like exploring Ordosish culture and making unique characters.
Yeah. But I bet there were folks who weren't so happy about it.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
D&D has a lot of, like, longtime fans who are really attached to tradition.
Right.
You know, they might feel like it's making things too complicated
Wow.
or that it's taking away from the classic experience they're used to.
Right.
Some people worry about losing that, like, monstrous element of orcs.
Yeah.
Like the thrill of battling something truly alien.
So it's like they want to keep that classic good versus evil dynamic.
Exactly. It's understandable, though, right?
Yeah.
Change can be hard, especially for something like D&D.
Right.
Which is so rooted in tradition.
But it's interesting because this debate, it goes beyond just game mechanics. You know, it's tapping into these bigger conversations about representation and cultural sensitivity and how we view the other.
Exactly. It's forcing players to, like, confront their own ideas about orcs. If they're not just mindless enemies anymore, then how do we see them? What are their motivations? What kind of societies do they build?
It really makes you think.
It does. And it can lead to some really interesting discussions.
Yeah. Not just at the gaming table.
Right. Like, even outside the game.
So I'm curious, like, if I'm a dungeon master who's used to just grabbing an orc stat block from the monster manual.
Yeah.
How do I even begin to create, like, a nuanced orc character?
Right.
Or a whole Orcish society?
That's a great question. And the article from LitRPG Reads actually gives some good examples.
Oh,
yeah. They suggest thinking about real-world cultures and using them as inspiration, but with a fantasy twist.
I like that.
So, for example, you could draw inspiration from nomadic tribes, like the Mongols, known for their horsemanship and military prowess. And imagine an Orcish society built around, like, mounted combat and fierce loyalty to their clan.
So instead of just being brutes, these orcs are like skilled riders and strategists.
Literally.
And they have this strong sense of honor.
Exactly.
That's really cool.
Or you could look at ancient civilizations like the Romans, known for their engineering and lawmaking,
Right.
and envision an Orcish empire with impressive architecture and a strong sense of civic duty.
So they're not just about conquering, they're about building and governing.
Exactly.
That's a really interesting contrast.
You could even have conflicts within that society.
Oh, yeah.
Like factions who believe in expansion versus those who want peace and stability.
That would be cool.
The point is there's so much room for creativity when you move away from stereotypes.
It's like the world is your oyster.
Exactly.
You can draw inspiration from anywhere.
Right. History, geography, mythology.
It's up to the dungeon master to decide what kind of orcs they want to create.
And that's what makes it so exciting.
Yeah.
It empowers dungeon masters to create unique gaming experiences.
It's not about following a script anymore.
Right.
It's about building a world that reflects your own imagination.
Exactly.
This whole shift makes me wonder about other classic D&D monsters. Could we see goblins or kobolds or even drow getting the same treatment?
That's a great question. And the article mentions goblins, kobolds, and drow
Oh, wow.
as potential candidates for similar upgrades.
So it seems like D&D is moving towards a future
Yeah,
where even the most monstrous creatures have the potential for complexity.
exactly.
That's really interesting. I can already imagine the possibilities.
Right.
Goblins as inventors,
Yeah.
kobolds as devout worshippers, drow as assassins with complex motivations.
It really opens up a whole new world of storytelling.
It's a good reminder that even in a fantasy world, nothing is black and white.
Totally.
Every creature, no matter how monstrous, has their own story to tell.
Exactly.
Yeah, it really makes you think, like, what other changes could be coming down the line?
Right. It's like D&D is saying, hey, let's shake things up and really challenge what these creatures can be.
I'm also wondering about, like, the practical side of things. You know, how does this change how we actually play the game?
Oh, it definitely has an impact. For dungeon masters, it means being ready to improvise more.
Okay.
You know, instead of just using those preset stat blocks, they might have to come up with custom stats for orcs.
So it's more about understanding what makes these orcs unique.
Exactly. Like, what's their culture? Like, what environment do they live in? Even what are their individual personalities?
That's pretty cool. It makes the dungeon master's job a lot more creative.
Yeah. And for players, creating an orc character becomes a much deeper experience.
Right, because you're not just picking a race from a list.
Right. You're building a whole backstory, a culture, a way of life. It's way more immersive.
And I bet it leads to some interesting role-playing moments, too.
Oh, totally. Like, how do other characters react to an orc in the party?
Right. Are they suspicious? Are they open-minded?
Exactly. It forces everyone at the table to think about their own biases.
It's like D&D is becoming a way to explore these real-world issues.
Yeah, like prejudice and discrimination, but in a safe and imaginative way.
This whole deep dive has been really eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's made me realize there's so much more to these fantasy tropes than we might think.
And it's great to see D&D pushing those boundaries, challenging us to think differently.
So to wrap things up, a huge thanks to you for sharing your insights on this topic.
It's been my pleasure.
And to all our listeners, we want to know what you think about this change. Does it excite you? Does it worry you? Let us know in the comments below.
And a big shout out to LitRPG Reads and Paul Bello for their awesome article that got this whole conversation started.
Be sure to check out their work for more great D&D content.
And until next time, keep those dice rolling.
And your imagination soaring.